The first thing I heard wasn't my mother's voice. It was the sound of something crashing into a wall, followed by a sharp slap that made my stomach turn. Then a man's voice filled the phone. "I swear to God, Linda, file those divorce papers and I'll bury both of you." The line went silent. For 3 long seconds I couldn't breathe. Then I heard my mother's whisper, "Emily, don't come home." The call disconnected. I was already reaching for my truck keys before I realized my hands were shaking. "My name is Emily Carter. I'm 36 years old and I live in Virginia Beach, about 45 minutes from my mother's little ranch house in Norfolk. Most people who know me think I'm just another retired Navy veteran. I volunteer twice a week at the local Veterans Center, fix things around my neighborhood when someone needs help, and spend Saturday mornings drinking coffee at a diner called Bayside Family Restaurant where everybody knows everybody else's business." That's exactly how I wanted my life. Quiet. Predictable. Ordinary. Very few people know what I actually did during my years in the Navy. I never talk about it. Not because it's classified anymore, but because I learned a long time ago that the loudest people usually have the least to prove. My mother respected that. She never asked questions. She was simply happy to have me home. Things had been peaceful until she met Rick Dalton. At first, everybody loved him. Rick owned a small construction company that renovated kitchens and bathrooms around Norfolk and Chesapeake. He always seemed to know somebody. At church, he carried folding chairs before anyone asked. He bought coffee for strangers at Wawa. He laughed loudly and told stories that somehow made him sound like the hero every single time. My mother hadn't smiled much after Dad died from a heart attack 7 years earlier. Then Rick showed up. She started smiling again. Seeing that smile made me ignore the little things that bothered me. Like how Rick answered questions meant for her, or how he insisted on paying every restaurant bill with her debit card while joking that he was teaching her financial responsibility. At Thanksgiving, he teased her because she'd overcooked the green beans. Everyone laughed. My mother laughed too, but something about her smile looked practiced. I noticed. I just didn't know what it meant yet. About 8 months after they married, she stopped calling every evening. Instead of our usual 30-minute conversations, she'd send short texts. "Busy today. Talk tomorrow. Everything's fine." The words were always the same. Everything's fine. If you've ever loved someone who's afraid, you know those are sometimes the most frightening words in the English language. One Tuesday afternoon, I drove to her house without calling first. Rick answered the door. "Emily," he said with a grin big enough to sell used cars. "Your mom's taking a nap." "I'll wait." No need, she was up late. Something felt wrong. The house smelled like fresh paint. Not because anyone had painted. Because someone was trying to cover another smell. I caught a glimpse of my mother walking through the hallway. She wore sunglasses. Inside, Rick stepped sideways until I couldn't see her anymore. "She's been getting migraines." "Funny," I said. "She never had migraines before." He smiled again. "People change." I looked at him for another second. Then I left. Halfway to my truck, I glanced back through the living room window. Mom was standing there. She slowly took off her sunglasses. Even from 40 feet away, I saw the purple bruise around her left eye. She quickly pulled the curtains shut. That image stayed with me all week. I barely slept. Every terrible possibility kept replaying in my head. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe she'd fallen. Maybe, deep down, I knew better. The following Thursday, around 6 in the evening, my phone rang. "Mom," I answered immediately. She sounded out of breath. "I'm at Walmart," she whispered. The Walmart on Tidewater Drive. I knew the parking lot. "I only have a minute." "Mom, what's happening?" "I met with a lawyer." I sat down hard in the chair beside my kitchen table. "You did?" I filed. Before I could answer, I heard a truck door slam. Then Rick shouted somewhere nearby. "Linda." Her breathing changed instantly. Panic. Real panic. "Emily." Another slam. Footsteps. Then everything happened so fast I can still hear it if I close my eyes. Rick yelling. Mom crying. A loud crack. Something hitting pavement. Then that threat. "If you think divorce is happening, you're both dead." I grabbed my keys. Called 911 while running outside. I don't remember the drive. Only flashes. Traffic lights. Rain hitting the windshield. The dispatcher asking me to slow down. By the time I reached Norfolk, police cruisers were already parked outside Mom's house. An ambulance sat nearby with its lights flashing but no siren. My heart sank. An officer stopped me before I reached the front porch. "You family?" "I'm her daughter." He looked relieved. "Your mother says she slipped getting out of her vehicle." "No." He frowned. "Ma'am, my mother didn't fall." Before he could respond, Mom stepped onto the porch. She had a small bandage above her eyebrow. Her hands trembled. Rick stood behind her with one hand resting gently on her shoulder. To anyone watching, he looked like a concerned husband. He even smiled at me. "She's okay, Emily." Mom wouldn't look me in the eyes. The officer quietly asked if everything was all right at home. She nodded. "Yes, you sure?" Positive. The officer had no choice. Without a witness or visible evidence beyond what she explained away, there wasn't much he could do. The patrol cars eventually pulled away. Rain dripped from the oak trees lining the street. Rick waited until the last cruiser disappeared around the corner. Then he leaned close enough that only I could hear. "You should have stayed in Virginia Beach." His smile never moved. Neither did mine. For one long moment, we simply looked at each other. He thought he was intimidating me. What he didn't understand was that I'd spent years looking into the eyes of people far more dangerous than him. But this wasn't overseas. This was my mother. And unlike every mission I'd ever been assigned, this one came with emotions I couldn't control. As I drove home that night, I realized something that scared me even more than Rick's threats. He wasn't losing control. He believed he already owned her. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Whatever peaceful life I'd built after leaving the Navy could wait. Because I wasn't leaving my mother alone with him again. The morning after I confronted Rick on my mother's porch, I stopped pretending this was something that would work itself out. For years, I'd trained myself to stay calm under pressure. Panic clouds judgment. Anger makes people careless. In the Navy, those lessons could mean the difference between life and death. Back home, they meant something different. If I wanted to protect my mother, I needed facts instead of assumptions. I started by calling her every morning at exactly 8. Sometimes she answered. Sometimes she texted instead. Sometimes there was nothing. Those were the hardest days. A week later, she finally agreed to meet me for breakfast. Not at her usual diner. She insisted on Waffle House near Military Highway because, in her words, Rick never eats there. That sentence alone told me everything. Nobody should choose a restaurant because they're hiding from their husband. She looked exhausted. The bruise near her eyebrow had faded into a pale yellow, but new marks peeked out beneath the sleeve of her cardigan whenever she reached for her coffee. We ordered scrambled eggs and toast. Neither of us touched much of it. "I embarrassed you," she said quietly. "You didn't." "I lied to the police. You were scared." She looked out the window toward the parking lot. "I don't even recognize myself anymore." I reached across the table. "You don't have to do this alone." Her eyes filled with tears almost instantly. "I kept thinking if I tried harder," she whispered. "No. If dinner was ready?" "No. If the house stayed clean?" "No, Mom. If I didn't argue," I squeezed her hand. "This isn't because of anything you did." She finally looked at me. I know. It was the first time she'd admitted it aloud. That single sentence felt bigger than either of us. Over the next 2 weeks, our lives settled into a strange routine. Mom would invent excuses to leave the house. A grocery run. A pharmacy pickup. Returning something to Kohl's. Most of the errands were fake. Instead, we'd meet in parking lots or quiet coffee shops. I bought her a prepaid cell phone and hid it inside an old knitting bag she kept in the trunk of her Honda Accord. She laughed when I handed it to her. "I feel like I'm in one of those spy movies." "You'd make a terrible spy." She smiled. "Why?" "You've apologized to 3 strangers since we walked in." For the first time in months, I heard her genuine laugh. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Still, it reminded me she was still in there somewhere. Little by little, the truth came out. Rick had emptied one of her savings accounts 6 months earlier. He'd convinced her it was for business taxes. Instead, he'd bought himself a fishing boat. He'd canceled her book club because, according to him, those old ladies filled her head with nonsense. He checked the mileage on her car every evening. If she drove farther than expected, he demanded an explanation. He insisted on keeping every password, every bank account, every utility bill, everything. The abuse wasn't just physical. It had become her entire world. One Tuesday afternoon, I accompanied her to meet divorce attorney Karen Mitchell in Chesapeake. Karen was probably in her early 60s. Gray hair, reading glasses hanging from a chain. She had the calm confidence of someone who'd seen every ugly version of marriage ending. She listened for nearly an hour without interrupting. When Mom finished, Karen folded her hands. "Linda, I need to ask something difficult." Mom nodded. "Has he ever threatened your life?" The room fell silent. Mom stared at the legal pad in front of her. Then she whispered, "Many times." Karen didn't react dramatically. She simply wrote something down. "What about your daughter?" Mom looked toward me. "He says if I leave him, he'll make sure Emily pays too." Karen nodded again. "I've heard those threats before." Mom frowned. "You have..." Unfortunately, Karen explained protective orders, emergency hearings, asset freezes. Police reports. Documentation. Every step sounded overwhelming. By the end of the meeting, Mom looked exhausted again. As we walked toward the parking garage, she suddenly stopped. I can't do it. Yes, you can. What if he finds out? He will. He'll lose his mind. I know. What if... I interrupted gently. What if he already has... She didn't answer. She simply leaned against my shoulder and cried. 3 days later, she signed the papers. Karen filed for divorce that same afternoon. Rick found out before dinner. I learned that because my phone rang at 8:17 p.m. Mom was whispering again. He knows. Where are you? In the bathroom. I heard shouting outside the door. Cabinet slamming. Glass breaking. Then Rick's voice. You think you're taking my house? Another crash. I built this life. Mom covered the phone. I could barely hear her. I'm calling the police. No, she whispered urgently. If I call now, he'll know it was me. The line went dead. I drove there again. This time I arrived too late. Neighbors stood outside watching. One woman pointed toward the driveway. Rick was loading tools into his pickup. A Norfolk police cruiser sat nearby. An officer recognized me from the week before. He broke a dining room table, the officer said quietly. Your mother says they argued over finances. I looked past him. The front window had been shattered. Rick carried a toolbox outside like nothing unusual had happened. As he climbed into his truck, he looked directly at me, then smiled. He rolled down the window. You know, he called loudly enough for everyone to hear family disagreements happen. Several neighbors nodded awkwardly. Then, when nobody else could hear, his expression changed. He leaned toward me. I'm coming to your house next. My jaw tightened. If she hides there, he pointed one finger at my chest. I'll burn it to the ground. Then he drove away. That night I sat alone in my living room. The old cedar chest beside my fireplace held photographs from my Navy years. Team pictures, challenge coins, awards, a folded flag. Everything Rick knew nothing about. Part of me wanted to tell him exactly who I had been, to watch his confidence disappear. Instead, I closed the lid. People like Rick respected only power they could see. He underestimated quiet people. That was his weakness. I intended to let him keep making that mistake. 3 days later, Karen called. I have good news and bad news. I'll take the bad first, she sighed. Rick hired a private investigator. I wasn't surprised. What did they find? Your military record. And Karen chuckled softly. Almost nothing. I laughed for the first time in weeks. That figures. The investigator confirmed you served in the Navy, but large sections of your file are unavailable. Good. Rick apparently told people you were probably just pushing paperwork behind a desk. I smiled despite myself. He really believes that... So I've been told. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then Karen's voice turned serious. He also told someone at the courthouse he's planning to pay your mother a visit this weekend. I stared out my front window toward the quiet street. Children rode bicycles past my mailbox. A neighbor watered his lawn. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. But I knew something was coming. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't going to wait for Rick Dalton to make the first move. Karen's warning stayed with me all week. Rick says he's coming to your house. She hadn't sounded dramatic when she said it. Karen had spent more than 30 years handling divorce cases. If anything, she had a habit of understating danger instead of exaggerating it. That Friday afternoon, I drove past my mother's house before heading home. Her Honda was gone. So was Rick's truck. I called her secret phone. She answered on the second ring. I'm okay, she whispered. Where are you? At the grocery store. By yourself? Yes. I let out a slow breath. Good. He keeps calling. Don't answer. I haven't. You coming to my place tonight? There was a long pause. I don't want to bring trouble to your house. You aren't bringing it. Another silence. He is. When I got home, I walked around my property one more time. My house wasn't fancy. A single-story brick home in a quiet Virginia Beach neighborhood about 15 minutes from the ocean. The backyard backed up to a small wooded area where kids built forts every summer. Mrs. Harrison, my 72-year-old neighbor, was watering her roses. She waved. Evening, Emily. Evening. You expecting company? I might be. She smiled. I'll bake extra brownies. That was her solution to almost everything. Birthdays, storms, neighborhood meetings, brownies. I smiled back. I appreciate that. Inside, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad. Old habits die hard. Whenever life became complicated, I made lists. One page said, things I know. Rick is impulsive. He wants control. He enjoys performing for an audience. He hates being ignored. Another page said, things I don't know. How far he'll go. Whether he'll bring a weapon. Whether he'll be drinking. Whether he's bluffing. Those unanswered questions bothered me more than the threats themselves. Instead of trying to handle everything alone, I made a few phone calls. Not to old teammates asking them to fight. That wasn't who we were. I called people I trusted. Mike Reynolds had retired from the Navy 2 years before I did. Now he worked private security for a shipping company in Norfolk. His wife Denise was a deputy sheriff. When Mike answered, I got straight to the point. I need advice. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sighed. You already notify local police? Tomorrow morning. Good. You think I'm overreacting? No. You think I'm underreacting? I do. The next morning, I visited the Virginia Beach Police Precinct. Officer James Monroe sat with me for almost 40 minutes. I handed him copies of Rick's threatening text messages, photos of Mom's bruises, the police report numbers from Norfolk. He looked through everything carefully. You've done a good job documenting this. I learned to write things down. He nodded. If he comes here and starts making threats, call us immediately. I will. And don't try handling him yourself. I gave him a tired smile. I wasn't planning to. He studied my face for a second. I'm serious. So am I. Saturday arrived warm and humid. By 11 in the morning, Mom was sitting in my living room reading one of her mystery novels. She hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. You aren't reading. I know. You want more coffee? I've had 3 cups. You've always had a nervous stomach. She smiled faintly. I wonder where you got yours. I was hoping you'd tell me. For a few minutes, we laughed about nothing important. It felt wonderful. Normal conversations had become so rare they almost felt like a luxury. Then the doorbell camera chimed. Someone had pulled into my driveway. Mom froze. I stood up. On the monitor, a black Ford F-150 filled the screen. Rick climbed out. Even through the camera, I could see anger written all over his face. He wasn't alone. Another man sat in the passenger seat but stayed inside the truck. Probably someone from work, or maybe just someone willing to watch. Either way, it didn't matter. Rick marched toward my front porch. Then he slammed both fists against my door. Emily. Another bang. I know you're in there. Mom whispered my name. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped her coffee mug. I gently took it from her. Stay here. Don't open the door. I have to. I unlocked it and stepped outside, closing it behind me. Rick looked disappointed. He'd expected yelling. Instead, I simply stood there. What do you want? My wife. She's not your property. His face reddened immediately. You think you're funny? No. You've been poisoning her against me. I haven't had to. He took one step closer. You got about 10 seconds to bring her outside. I don't. He laughed. You always this mouthy. I learned from watching you. That landed. His smile disappeared. By then, several neighbors had wandered onto their front porches. Mrs. Harrison stood beside her mailbox, pretending to trim flowers. Across the street, 2 teenage boys suddenly found endless reasons to wash an already clean pickup truck. Everyone knew something was happening. Rick noticed, too. He lowered his voice. You really want to embarrass your mother? I think you've handled that yourself. He pointed toward my house. She's coming home. No, you don't get a vote. I already voted. What? I voted the day she filed for divorce. For half a second, he looked genuinely confused. Then he understood. His jaw tightened. You think some judge is going to save you? I think judges like evidence. His eyes wandered through my front window. On the bookshelf sat a small wooden display case. Inside were several challenge coins and a folded American flag. Rick pointed toward it. So that's what all this is? My home, he snorted. Cute little collection. I didn't answer. He leaned closer. You really expect me to believe you're some kind of hero? I don't expect you to believe anything. That irritated him even more. People like Rick depended on emotional reactions. Calm made them uncomfortable. Then something happened that nobody could have planned. Rick turned, dramatically pointing toward my driveway while shouting loudly enough for the whole neighborhood. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. As he spun around, his boot caught the garden hose stretched across the edge of my lawn. His feet flew out from under him. He landed flat on his back with a loud grunt. For one long second, nobody moved. Then 12-year-old Tommy from next door accidentally laughed. Not loudly. Just one quick snort. Rick scrambled to his feet, red-faced. Tommy immediately disappeared behind his father's truck. Even Mrs. Harrison suddenly became very interested in her roses again. I bit the inside of my cheek. Hard. It was the only thing stopping me from laughing, too. Humiliation made Rick even more dangerous. He walked back toward me slowly. His voice was almost calm now. "This isn't over." "I know. You've got no idea what you've started." "No." I looked him straight in the eye. "But I know exactly what you've been doing." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Only for a moment. Then he turned and climbed back into his truck. As it pulled away, I noticed something odd. The passenger never looked at me once. He stared straight ahead the entire time, like he wanted no part of what had just happened. That evening, Mom finally relaxed enough to eat dinner. We ordered barbecue from Mission BBQ down the road. She even teased me because I'd forgotten extra cornbread. It almost felt like life before Rick. Almost. At 9 that night, my phone rang. "Karen, please tell me you have good news." "I wish." "What happened?" "There was activity on Linda's retirement account this afternoon." My stomach tightened. "What kind of activity?" "A withdrawal." "She didn't authorize one." "I know." "How much?" Karen took a breath. "Almost everything." I stood so quickly my chair tipped backward. "That's impossible." "It shouldn't have happened." But it did. I looked toward Mom, who was quietly washing dishes in the kitchen, completely unaware. The divorce had never been just about escaping an abusive husband. Now it was about recovering a lifetime of savings before they disappeared forever. And suddenly I understood why Rick had come to my house today. He hadn't expected to take Linda back. He'd come to distract us. While we were watching him, he'd already made his next move. I didn't tell my mother about the missing money that night. She had finally fallen asleep on my couch sometime after 11, still wrapped in the quilt my grandmother had sewn almost 40 years ago. The television was on low volume, playing an old episode of Blue Bloods. She hadn't made it through the opening scene. For the first time in weeks, she looked peaceful. I couldn't take that away from her. Not yet. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, and every bank statement Karen had emailed spread across the table. Something didn't add up. Rick wasn't smart enough to pull off a complicated financial scheme by accident. If he'd drained nearly all of Mom's retirement account, he'd planned it. The question was how. Karen called first thing Monday morning. "I've been speaking with the bank's fraud department." "What did they say?" "The withdrawal happened Friday afternoon, the same day he came to my house." "Exactly. So while he was keeping us occupied, he was finishing paperwork at the bank." I rubbed my forehead. "Did they approve it?" "They shouldn't have." "But they did." Karen sighed. "The signatures don't look right." My head snapped up. "They're forged." "We can't say that officially yet." "But you think they are." "I do." That was enough for me. By lunchtime, we were sitting inside a branch office of Tidewater Community Bank. The branch manager, a woman named Angela Brooks, welcomed us into a small conference room. She looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I'm very sorry you're dealing with this." "So are we," Karen replied. Angela placed several forms on the table. "This withdrawal required your mother's signature." Karen slid one of the copies toward me. Even without being an expert, I knew something was wrong. Linda always made her capital L with a small loop. This signature didn't. The handwriting leaned differently. The pressure was uneven. It looked like someone had practiced writing her name over and over until they got close enough. Karen looked at Angela. "Has your fraud department reviewed this?" "They have." "And they've opened an investigation. Will the funds be frozen?" Angela nodded. "We've already flagged the transfer." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For the first time in days, I felt like someone besides us was finally taking this seriously. That afternoon, I decided my mother deserved the truth. She sat across from me at my dining room table, stirring a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. "I need to tell you something." She immediately looked worried. "What happened?" "Rick moved money out of your retirement account." Her face went completely blank. "No, we think he forged your signature." She shook her head slowly. "He couldn't." "He may have." "My pension. We're trying to stop it." Tears filled her eyes. "I worked 32 years at Norfolk General Hospital." I nodded. "I know." "I skipped vacations." "I know." "I worked holidays." "I know." She looked down at her hands. "That money wasn't for me. It wasn't. It was supposed to help my grandchildren someday." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Even after everything Rick had done to her, she was still thinking about people who didn't even exist yet. That was my mother. She always planned for tomorrow. Rick only cared about today. The investigation uncovered more than any of us expected. Angela called Karen 3 days later. Another account had surfaced. It wasn't in Mom's name. It belonged to Rick. Large deposits had been made over the past 18 months. Cash. Wire transfers. Checks from customers. Some legitimate. Some difficult to explain. Karen recommended bringing in law enforcement. Detective Carlos Ramirez from the Norfolk Police Financial Crimes Unit met with us Friday morning. He wasn't flashy, just a middle-aged detective with reading glasses and a notebook that looked like it had been through 20 years of investigations. He listened far more than he spoke. When Karen finished summarizing everything, he asked one question. "Has Mr. Dalton ever been accused of fraud before?" We all looked at each other. "I don't know," Mom admitted. Detective Ramirez nodded thoughtfully. "I'll find out." He did. Much faster than any of us expected. 3 days later, he called. "I think we've got a pattern." "What kind?" "There were complaints." "Against Rick?" "Several." My stomach tightened. "Domestic violence?" "Some." "What else?" "Insurance claims." "Construction disputes." "Forged invoices." He paused. None of them resulted in convictions. "Why not?" "Witnesses stopped cooperating." I didn't have to ask why. Fear has a way of making decent people disappear. Then something happened none of us saw coming. I received an email from someone named Rachel Simmons. Subject line: "I think we're talking about the same man." At first I assumed it was spam. Then I opened it. The first sentence stopped me cold. "Rick Dalton broke 2 of my ribs in 2016. I called the number she included. Rachel lived outside Richmond. She was 51 years old and worked as a dental hygienist. She dated Rick for almost 2 years before my mother met him. "He told everyone I was crazy," she said. "What really happened? I left. And he stalked me for months." She laughed bitterly. "I was too embarrassed to tell people." "You shouldn't have been." "I know that now." She hesitated. "I kept everything." "What do you mean?" "Pictures, medical records, emails, voicemails." I sat forward. "You still have them?" "I never deleted a thing." The following Saturday, Rachel drove to Virginia Beach. She walked into my house carrying 2 cardboard boxes. One was filled with photographs. The other held neatly organized folders. She smiled nervously. "I've been waiting years for someone to ask." My mother looked at her with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry." Rachel gently touched Mom's hand. "You don't owe me an apology." "No, I do." We both believed him. Rachel nodded. That's how men like Rick survive. For the next 4 hours, we went through everything. Hospital discharge papers, threatening emails, repair estimates for Rachel's damaged car, screenshots, text messages, a police report from Henrico County. None of it had been enough by itself. Together it painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. For the first time, my mother realized something important. She had never been the only victim. Even with all the evidence, I found myself awake at 2 a.m. staring out the kitchen window. What if it still wasn't enough? I'd seen people escape accountability before. I'd seen good evidence dismissed because a witness got scared. I hated admitting it, but I was afraid. Not of Rick. Of disappointment. Of watching my mother believe in justice one more time only to lose faith all over again. Mike called the next afternoon. "You sound tired." "I am." "You doing that thing again?" "What thing?" "Trying to carry everything yourself." I smiled. "You always could read me. You know what your biggest problem is?" "I've got several." "You think asking for help means losing control." He wasn't wrong. Military life teaches you to solve problems. Family teaches you that some problems can't be solved alone. Those lessons don't always fit together. On Wednesday afternoon, Karen called with news I'd been waiting weeks to hear. The judge signed the order. I nearly dropped my coffee. "What order?" "The hearing." "When?" "3 weeks from today." I looked across the room. Mom was tending the small tomato plants we'd placed on the back patio. She looked calmer than she had in months. She caught me smiling. "What is it?" I covered the phone and smiled back. "I think we're finally getting our day in court." Karen wasn't finished. "One more thing." "What?" "Rick told someone outside the courthouse this morning that we're wasting our time." "What exactly did he say?" She laughed quietly. "He said," I could almost hear her reading from her notes, "they've got nothing." I looked out toward the backyard. For the first time since this all began, I hoped he truly believed that. Because people are at their most careless when they think they've already won. By the time the hearing finally arrived, I'd stopped imagining dramatic endings. Life had already taught me something important. Justice usually doesn't arrive with loud speeches or last-minute surprises. Most of the time, it walks through the front door carrying a stack of paperwork. 3 weeks had passed since the judge scheduled the hearing. During those weeks, Rick violated the temporary protective order twice. He drove past my house one evening. Another time, he parked across the street from Mom's attorney's office for nearly an hour. Karen documented everything. Detective Carlos Ramirez documented everything. For the first time in his life, Rick's actions weren't disappearing into thin air. Someone was keeping score. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning at the Chesapeake Circuit Court. I arrived just after 8. The courthouse parking lot was already filling with attorneys carrying leather briefcases and couples who looked like they hadn't slept in days. Mom sat beside me in my pickup truck. She stared through the windshield without saying a word. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded. "No, I figured." She managed a small smile. "I've never been inside a courtroom before." "I have." She looked surprised. "You have?" I smiled. "Long story." She laughed softly. "I suppose it is." For a few seconds the tension eased. Then we walked inside. Courtrooms are quieter than television makes them look. Nobody shouted. Nobody argued dramatically. People spoke in low voices. Deputies nodded politely as they checked everyone through security. The smell of old paper and fresh coffee lingered in the hallway. Karen met us outside courtroom 3B. "You both ready?" "As ready as we're going to be," I said. She looked at Mom. "You don't have to prove you're a perfect person." Mom frowned. "What?" "You only have to tell the truth." Rick arrived a few minutes later wearing a navy blue suit I'd never seen before. He looked clean-cut. Fresh haircut. Shined shoes. American flag pin on his lapel. If someone didn't know him, they'd probably think he was a successful businessman attending a Chamber of Commerce meeting. He smiled as though nothing had happened. His attorney walked beside him carrying several file folders. Rick spotted us immediately. "Morning, ladies." Neither of us answered. He laughed. Still giving me the silent treatment, Karen stepped between us. "Save it for the courtroom." Rick shrugged. "I've got nothing to hide." Karen looked him straight in the eye. "That's what concerns me." The hearing began exactly on time. Judge Eleanor Watkins entered the courtroom. Everyone stood. She reviewed the case briefly before inviting Karen to begin. Karen didn't waste time. She started with facts. The marriage. The separation. The divorce filing. The documented threats. Medical photographs. Police reports. One piece at a time. No theatrics. Just evidence. Rick's attorney objected occasionally. Sometimes the judge agreed. Sometimes she didn't. The hearing moved steadily forward. Then Mom testified. I'd never seen her so nervous. She adjusted the microphone twice before speaking. Her hands trembled. Judge Watkins noticed. "Mrs. Dalton," she said kindly, "take your time." Mom nodded. She described how Rick slowly isolated her. How he convinced her to stop seeing friends. How every paycheck eventually went into accounts she couldn't access. Then she talked about the first time he hit her. The courtroom became completely silent. She didn't cry. She didn't exaggerate. She simply described what happened. Somehow that made it even harder to hear. Rick's attorney tried to paint a different picture. "Mrs. Dalton," he said, "isn't it true you've struggled with anxiety for years?" "Yes." "So it's possible you've misunderstood your husband's intentions." "No." "Were you angry when he questioned your spending?" "I was frightened." "Those aren't the same thing." "No, they aren't." For the first time I saw confidence return to my mother's face. She wasn't arguing. She was simply refusing to let someone rewrite her life. Then it was my turn. I raised my right hand and took the oath. Karen smiled reassuringly. "Please state your name." "Emily Carter." She asked about the threatening phone call, the injuries I'd witnessed, the photographs, the hidden phone, the security camera footage. Then she stopped. "Ms. Carter, your military background has been mentioned several times." Rick's attorney immediately stood. "Objection, relevance," Karen answered calmly. "It goes directly to the defendant's repeated claims that my client fabricated evidence." Judge Watkins nodded. "I'll allow limited testimony." Karen looked back at me. "Did your military service influence how you responded to these events?" "Yes." "How?" I took a slow breath. "It taught me something simple." "What was that?" "When people are emotional, memories fade." The courtroom remained silent. "So whenever something important happened, I documented it." "You documented everything." "As much as I could." "No further questions." That was it. No stories. No classified missions. No dramatic revelations. Just the truth. Rick looked irritated. He took the stand after lunch. For nearly 40 minutes he insisted everyone else had misunderstood him. His ex-girlfriend was lying. The neighbors exaggerated. The police overreacted. The bank made mistakes. Linda was emotional. I was controlling. Karen was chasing attorney fees. According to Rick, everyone else was the problem. Everyone except Rick. Then Karen stood for cross-examination. She walked slowly toward the witness stand carrying one folder. "Mr. Dalton." "Yes." You testified that you've never controlled your wife's finances. Correct. Karen held up a bank statement. Would you like to explain why your name appears as the only authorized user on an account funded entirely by Mrs. Dalton's retirement income? Rick hesitated. It was easier. Easier for whom? No answer. Karen picked up another document. You also testified you never threatened Mrs. Dalton. That's right. She pressed a button. A speaker on the evidence table crackled to life. Rick's voice filled the courtroom. If you leave me, I'll make sure your daughter regrets it for the rest of her life. The recording ended. Nobody moved? Karen quietly asked. Is that your voice? Rick swallowed. Yes, the rest happened surprisingly fast. Detective Ramirez testified about the financial investigation. Angela Brooks from the bank explained the forged signature. Rachel Simmons described the abuse she'd suffered years earlier. Her testimony wasn't offered to prove Rick had assaulted my mother. It established a pattern of intimidation and coercive behavior. Piece by piece, the story Rick had spent years constructing collapsed under the weight of ordinary, verifiable facts. When both attorneys finished, Judge Watkins removed her glasses and looked directly at Rick. Mr. Dalton, she said, this court finds your testimony lacks credibility. She granted my mother a permanent protective order. She ordered temporary financial restitution while the fraud investigation continued. Then she referred the evidence to the Commonwealth's attorney for possible criminal prosecution involving forgery, financial fraud, and domestic assault. Rick stood so abruptly his chair scraped across the floor. This is ridiculous. Judge Watkins looked at him calmly. No, Mr. Dalton. She paused. This is accountability. A deputy sheriff stepped forward. Rick looked around the courtroom as if expecting someone to rescue him. Nobody did. As he was escorted toward the side door, he turned once more to glare at us. My mother didn't flinch. She simply reached over and quietly took my hand. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. After everything we'd been through, words suddenly seemed unnecessary. People ask me sometimes what the best day of my life has been. Was it graduating from Navy training? Was it the day I retired? Was it standing in that courtroom while Rick Dalton was finally held accountable? The truth surprises most people. The best day came 3 months later on a quiet Saturday morning when I walked into my mother's kitchen and found her singing while she burned a batch of blueberry muffins. They were terrible. She laughed harder than I'd heard her laugh in years. That's the day I knew we'd won. Not because Rick had lost. Because fear finally had. The legal process didn't end the day of the hearing. Real life rarely wraps itself up with a neat little bow. The Commonwealth's attorney reviewed Detective Ramirez's investigation for several weeks before filing criminal charges related to forgery and financial fraud. The bank completed its own investigation and determined my mother's signature had indeed been forged. Most of the money was recovered before it disappeared completely. Not every dollar, but enough for Mom to breathe again. Karen later told us that if we'd waited another week to report the suspicious withdrawal, the money might have been gone forever. That thought still makes me shiver. Sometimes timing changes everything. Rick eventually accepted a plea agreement on the financial charges. His construction business fell apart long before the criminal case ended. Customers canceled contracts. Suppliers stopped extending credit. Word travels quickly in communities like ours, especially when court records become public. No one celebrated his downfall. At least no decent person did. Consequences are different from revenge. One is about punishment. The other is simply the result of choices catching up with someone. Mom refused to stay in the old house. There are too many memories, she said one afternoon while packing dishes into cardboard boxes. She wasn't talking about the bad memories. She meant all of them. She'd lived there with my father. She'd planted flowers with him. They'd painted the guest bedroom together before I came home from my first deployment. Every room held pieces of 2 different lives. She decided it was time to start a third. With help from the recovered retirement money and the sale of the house, she bought a small townhouse in Chesapeake. 2 bedrooms, a tiny screened porch, just enough backyard for a few tomato plants. Nothing fancy. It was perfect. The first thing she hung on the wall wasn't a family photograph. It was a little wooden sign she'd found at a craft fair. Peace lives here. She smiled when she nailed it beside the front door. I think I've earned this. You absolutely have. Moving day turned into one of the funniest weekends I'd had in years. Mike and Denise showed up with a pickup truck. Mrs. Harrison insisted on bringing sandwiches even though nobody had asked her to. Rachel drove down from Richmond carrying 3 boxes labeled kitchen, all written in neat block letters. By noon, nobody could find the coffee maker. We searched everywhere. The garage, the pantry, even the coat closet. After nearly an hour, Mike opened one box labeled bathroom. There sat the coffee maker, Mom looked horrified. I have absolutely no memory of doing that. Mike grinned. Well, at least nobody packed the toilet in the kitchen. Without missing a beat, Mrs. Harrison answered. Don't give her ideas. For the first time in a long time, the laughter came easily. Nobody forced it. Nobody pretended. It simply happened. A few weeks later, Thanksgiving arrived. Mom insisted on hosting. I've got a smaller house, she admitted, so everybody squeezes. That turned out to be true. There were 11 of us crowded around a table built for 8. Mike carved the turkey. Denise somehow managed 3 different casseroles. Rachel brought homemade rolls. Mrs. Harrison ignored everyone's protests and baked 2 pecan pies. I volunteered to make mashed potatoes. I forgot to add salt. Mom took 1 bite. She smiled politely, then reached for the salt shaker without saying a word. The entire table burst into laughter. I survived Rick Dalton, she teased. I can survive your cooking. I walked right into that one. Yes, Mike said. You did. Even I had to laugh. After dinner, Mom and I stepped onto the screened porch while everyone else argued over football inside. The air had turned cool. A few leaves drifted across the yard. She wrapped a sweater around her shoulders. You know something? What? I used to think strength meant enduring. I looked at her. She continued. I thought if I just held on long enough, things would improve. They didn't. No? She looked toward the small garden we'd planted together. Strength was leaving. I nodded slowly. And asking for help. She reached over and squeezed my hand. I couldn't have done it without you. I smiled. You didn't. No, she smiled back. We did. A few mornings before Christmas, I drove down to the Virginia Beach oceanfront. I'd always gone there when I needed to think. The boardwalk was almost empty except for a few runners and an older couple walking their golden retriever. The Atlantic was calm. Gray winter waves rolled gently toward shore. I stood there for nearly half an hour. During my years in the Navy, I'd believed silence was a kind of protection. You kept your head down. You handled problems. You carried your own weight. But somewhere along the way, I'd confused silence with strength. They aren't the same thing. Keeping my military background private had never been the important decision. Speaking up for my mother had been. That was the moment that changed everything. Not because it made me brave. Because it reminded me that courage doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes courage is driving 45 minutes after a frightening phone call. Sometimes it's sitting beside someone in a lawyer's office while they sign divorce papers with shaking hands. Sometimes it's telling the truth in a courtroom without raising your voice. Those moments rarely make headlines. They still matter. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that abuse grows strongest in silence and weakest in daylight. People like Rick count on fear, embarrassment, and isolation. The moment those disappear, so does much of their power. My mother once believed she had no choices. Today she wakes up every morning in a home where nobody yells, nobody threatens, and nobody tells her she's worthless. That's a life worth protecting. And that's worth far more than revenge. If this story reminded you that it's never too late to stand beside someone who needs you, I hope you'll carry that thought with you. And if you enjoyed listening, thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself and don't be afraid to remind the people you love that they never have to face hard times alone.